I remember that day as if it were yesterday, even though I was only 5 years old. My name is Arabella, and that was the day my life changed forever. Dad had left on another business trip, leaving Mom and me alone in our cozy house on the outskirts of the city. I was playing with my dolls in the living room, immersed in an imaginary world where a doll princess always defeated the villains. That world was so vivid that outside noises seemed like a distant echo. But then I heard the doorbell. Mom, who had been folding clean laundry, dropped everything and hurried to the door. I turned around and saw her face light up as she opened it. Her expression was a mix of surprise and something strange. Her voice trembled as she spoke to me. "Arabella, sweetheart, go to your room and play." There was something unusual in her tone, a blend of excitement and unease that I, as a 5-year-old, couldn't understand but felt acutely. I obeyed, but I didn't leave immediately. Curiosity, like a tiny spark, ignited inside me. I peeked around the corner and saw a tall man standing at the door. His face was unfamiliar, but there was something imposing, almost intimidating, about his presence. He was dressed formally, a dark coat, a white shirt, shiny shoes, and carried himself with the air of someone who knew his arrival would change things. Mom quickly began packing a suitcase. I had never seen her like that before. She moved with urgency, almost desperation, throwing things into the bag without checking if they matched. It was as though every movement was driven by instinct rather than thought. The suitcase clicked shut, and Mom headed for the door, the same door I had been peeking through. I decided to step out from my hiding spot. "Mommy, where are you going?" I asked, feeling the words catch in my throat. I had never seen her like this before, as if a different woman stood before me. "I have to leave for a while, darling," she replied, avoiding my gaze. "Be a good girl for Daddy, okay?" I tried to reach for her hand, but she gently pulled away, leaving me without a hug, a kiss, or even a goodbye glance. She stepped out the door, the sound of the engine starting echoing behind her. The car slowly pulled away, disappearing from view and taking her with it. I stood on the doorstep, staring at the closed door, waiting for her to return. But she didn't. The house suddenly felt enormous and empty. The living room was filled with a silence so thick it seemed to press against my chest. I went back to my dolls, but now they looked unfamiliar, their plastic smiles only making me more irritated. Time seemed to slow down, as though the very air in the house had turned sluggish. By evening, fear began to creep in. Darkness invaded the rooms, filling every corner. I tried to turn on the light, but the switch was too high, and I couldn't reach it. The darkness seemed alive. I curled up in a corner, hugging my knees to my chest. Thousands of questions swirled in my mind, but there was no one to answer them. I cried, calling out for Mom, for Dad, but all I got in return was the rustle of the night. I didn't know how much time had passed, but hunger and thirst became unbearable. I was too afraid to move, too afraid of the darkness where I imagined monsters lurking, ready to grab me. When voices finally filled the house, at first I thought they were just another part of my fear. But then I recognized the familiar voice of our neighbor, Mrs. Monty, talking to someone. I'd been hearing a child crying for days. "I'm worried something might have happened," her words echoed in my mind. The door burst open, and a crowd of people flooded in, police officers, neighbors, and finally, my father. His face twisted in horror when he saw me. "Arabella," he cried, scooping me up in his arms. I clung to him, sobbing with relief. My little world seemed to regain its footing, but it was only the beginning. The new world without Mom was strange and painful, but time healed, albeit slowly. Dad, trying to fill the void, worked hard to become everything for me: parent, friend, teacher. His hands, accustomed to blueprints and paperwork, gradually learned the art of braiding my hair. At first, he did a terrible job: crooked braids, strands slipping out of elastics, but he didn't give up. Every morning, he sat with me in front of the mirror, patiently practicing until his fingers became adept. I tried my best too. I was only 7, but I felt a sense of responsibility for the two of us. Dad loved coffee with milk and a hint of bitterness. I learned to make it the way he liked and proudly placed a cup in front of him every morning. These small rituals became our lifeline, our new normal. During this time, our lives began to change again. One evening, Dad brought Leah home. She wasn't like Mom, and that was immediately clear. Leah seemed simpler, warmer. Her kind eyes and gentle smile brought a sense of calm. She didn't try to win me over, but her presence felt comforting. At first, I watched her warily, but over time, I realized she wasn't trying to replace Mom. She was creating her own space in our little family without pushing anyone out. Weeks turned into months, and Leah became an important part of our lives. One evening, I overheard Dad talking to her on the phone. His voice was soft, but I heard every word. "I think it's time, Leah. Will you move in with us?" A week later, Leah moved in. From that point on, the house felt different. She helped me with homework, braided my hair far better than Dad ever could, and always made sure a nightlight was on in my room. We became friends, and I felt safe with her. She never tried to take Mom's place, but she became something special. Her presence was like a warm blanket on a cold night, comforting and protective. By the time I was in 4th grade, Dad's company began to thrive. Soon, we moved into a big house with a garden, a pool, and even a walk-in closet in my room. I was thrilled, but some things stayed the same. I still slept with a nightlight and worried every time Dad went on a business trip. Sometimes at night, I would catch him sitting in the living room, looking at old photos of Mom. He thought I didn't notice, but I saw the sadness that crossed his face. On my 10th birthday, everything started as usual. I woke up to the smell of pancakes, Leah's special tradition. Dad had come home early from work to prepare a small party. Everything was perfect: balloons, music, laughter. But the day took an unexpected turn when the doorbell rang. I ran to the door and froze when I saw her. Mom. She looked older but just as beautiful. My gaze quickly shifted to her companion, a little girl, about 5 years old, clutching a worn teddy bear. The girl glanced around nervously, as if searching for a safe place to hide. Dad approached the door, and his voice tightened. "What are you doing here, Sophia?" He rarely called her by her name, and in that address, all his anger was evident. Mom took a deep breath. "Michael, I'm so sorry for everything," she began. "I know I have no right to be here, but—" She leaned toward the girl and placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is Kiara. She's your daughter." The room fell so silent I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my chest. A storm of emotions crossed Dad's face: shock, anger, disbelief, and something else I couldn't identify. "My daughter," he whispered. Mom nodded. "I was pregnant when I left. I didn't know then. I swear, Michael, I've made so many mistakes. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. But Kiara, she deserves to know her father." Dad knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. His voice wavered as he softly said, "Hi, Kiara. I'm your dad." Kiara looked at him hesitantly, her lips trembling. "Hi," she whispered, clutching the teddy bear tighter. I noticed Leah standing in the doorway, watching everything unfold. Her face had gone pale, as if the scene was unbearable for her. She turned and left the room so quickly I didn't have a chance to say anything. I wanted to follow her, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Raised voices, whispers, tears, all blended into chaos. I hid in my room, curled up in a corner, hugging my knees. Later that evening, Dad came into my room. His face looked exhausted. He sat on the edge of my bed and sighed deeply. "Arabella," he began, "I know this is a lot. Accepting your mom, everything she's done. But Kiara, she's not at fault. She's your sister." I stared at him, unsure what to say. "I've decided," he added. "I've decided to give your mom another chance. For Kiara's sake." The next day, I watched from the window as Leah loaded the last of her boxes into the trunk of her car. Her face was calm, but her movements carried a restrained pain. When she closed the trunk, her eyes met mine through the window. I stood there with tears in my eyes. She waved at me, and I, barely holding back my sobs, waved back. At that moment, I felt like a part of me was leaving with her. Leah had been the light that guided me through my darkest times. Now that light was fading, leaving an emptiness behind. That same day, Mom and Kiara moved into our house. Kiara, still clutching her teddy bear, timidly entered the guest room, as if afraid she wouldn't be welcome. Mom, on the other hand, reclaimed her old room next to Dad's without hesitation. It felt wrong. As if the last 5 years, all the tears, fears, and hopes, had never happened. Mom had simply erased them, like chalk from a blackboard, and returned as if nothing had changed. The first few months after Mom's return were difficult. She adored Kiara, her smiles grew wider, her voice softer whenever she spoke to her younger daughter. Meanwhile, I felt surrounded by an invisible wall. Every conversation between us was strained and brief. I tried not to resent Kiara, she was just a child caught in a whirlwind of circumstances she hadn't chosen. But watching how effortlessly she fit into Mom and Dad's lives was hard. Her cheerful laughter filled the house while I sat in my room, feeling more and more like a stranger in my own home. By the time I turned 18, I was ready for a change. College felt like a lifeline, a chance to start fresh. I chose zoology. Animals were easier than people. They didn't judge, hurt, or ask questions I couldn't answer. On the day of my departure, Dad hugged me tightly, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm so proud of you, Arabella," he said. "You're going to do great things." Mom merely patted my shoulder and wished me luck, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Kiara, who was 13 by then, rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "Finally, I get my own room." I pretended not to hear her and focused on Dad's warm embrace. College was my liberation. For the first time, I was far from the family tension, from the constant feeling that I didn't belong. I threw myself into my studies, finding solace in the world of animals. They were honest in their simplicity. I particularly bonded with Larry, an old llama from a small zoo where I volunteered. Larry didn't like people, but he seemed to tolerate me. His grumpiness and cantankerous nature became something of a mirror for my own feelings. For years flew by in what felt like a blink. On graduation day, I stood in my cap and gown, holding my diploma. Dad was in the crowd, beaming with pride, and I smiled back at him. Mom and Kiara were there too, clapping, though their applause felt forced. After the congratulations had been exchanged, Mom approached me and said dryly, "Your father and I talked, and we think it's time for you to find your own place. Time to spread your wings." Her words hit me like a stone. I turned to Dad, hoping for support, but he only looked away. His face held something like regret, but he said nothing. "Fine," I managed to say, keeping my voice steady. "I'll start looking right away." The days after graduation were tough. I returned to my childhood home, but it no longer felt like mine. The guest room, where Kiara had once stayed, was now filled with her belongings. She had claimed the space as though it had always been hers. The master bedroom, with its warm memories from my early years, now belonged to Mom. My presence in the house felt temporary, as if I were there on borrowed time. I tried searching for an apartment, but it turned out to be harder than I'd expected. I filled out applications, met with landlords, but each time I found an excuse not to commit. Part of me was scared to take that step, scared to sever the final ties to this house, no matter how alien it felt. Dad did his best to make me feel welcome, but even his sincere efforts couldn't offset the cold atmosphere Mom and Kiara created. They made it clear, in subtle but unmistakable ways, that I was an outsider in their new family. Their words and actions, though cloaked in politeness, gradually built an invisible wall. "Arabella, have you started looking for a job yet?" Mom asked one morning at breakfast, her tone sickly sweet, her gaze piercing. You know how important it is to get your foot in the door early. Yes, of course, I replied, trying to keep my voice even, though a knot tightened in my chest. And maybe you could find your own place, Kiara interjected, not bothering to hide her irritation. It's getting a bit cramped around here. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I finished my breakfast in silence and retreated to my room. Nights were the hardest. I still needed a nightlight to sleep, a habit that lingered from childhood, when darkness felt like a living enemy. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, Kiara barged into my room, her face lit up with a mocking grin. Seriously, she said, pointing at my nightlight. You're 22 and still afraid of the dark. No wonder you don't have any friends. I felt my cheeks burn with shame. Anger and humiliation wrestled inside me. Leave me alone, Kiara, I muttered, trying to sound indifferent. But she didn't stop. The next day at dinner, she brought it up again, this time in front of everyone. Mom, Dad, she began in an exaggeratedly concerned tone, don't you think Arabella should see a therapist or something? She's an adult who's afraid of the dark and can't make friends. That's not normal, is it? I felt something inside me snap. Years of pent-up pain and anger spilled out. Do you want to know why I'm like this? I said, my voice trembling. Because when I was 5 years old, my mother left me alone in a dark, empty house for days. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? Silence fell over the table. Dad stared down at his plate, his face frozen in guilt and pain. Mom's eyes widened in shock before quickly filling with tears. How dare you, she exclaimed, her voice rising sharply. How can you be so cruel and vindictive? I've tried so hard to make amends, to rebuild our family, and this is how you repay me? While Mom continued her tearful monologue, Kiara sat across from me, smirking triumphantly. In that moment, I realized I couldn't live there any longer. This house wasn't my home, and these people weren't my family. From that day on, I threw myself into the job hunt with renewed determination. A sense of purpose and a glimmer of hope kept me going. Eventually, I found a position at a small wildlife rehabilitation center. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. That morning, I left the house with cautious optimism. But when I arrived at the center, I was met with a note on the door, interviews canceled due to unforeseen circumstances. We apologize for the inconvenience. Disheartened, I headed home earlier than expected. As I opened the door, I heard voices coming from the living room. Mom and Kiara were talking so animatedly they didn't notice I had returned. I was about to announce my presence when I heard my name. If only Arabella weren't around, Kiara's sharp voice rang out. It's unfair that she gets any of Dad's money. She's not even part of this family. I know, sweetheart, Mom replied in a soothing tone. But we need to be patient. Once she moves out, it'll be easier to convince your father to change the will. We just have to keep nudging her toward leaving. I froze, as if icy water had been poured over my head. Their words struck me like a blow. They didn't just want me out of the house, they wanted me erased from their lives entirely. Worse, they were plotting to cut me out of my inheritance. Later, sitting in my room, I tried to make sense of the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What should I do? Should I tell Dad? Would he believe me over Mom and Kiara? They were his family now, or so it seemed. Maybe he'd choose them over me. My first stroke of luck came when I stumbled upon a job posting at the city zoo. They were looking for a zoologist to join their wildlife rehabilitation program. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it aligned with everything I had studied for and dreamed of doing. I applied immediately, and to my surprise and delight, I was invited for an interview. On the day of the interview, I stood outside the zoo's massive gates, taking deep breaths to calm my nerves. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. But all my fears dissipated once the interview began. The head zoologist, Dr. Martinez, was an open and kind woman. She listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions about my experience and knowledge, and then smiled warmly. You've got the job, Arabella. Welcome to the team." I nearly burst into tears right there. The relief and joy were overwhelming. Working at the zoo turned out to be even better than I could have imagined. Each day, I cared for injured animals, educated visitors about conservation, and participated in research projects. The world of animals became my refuge, my escape from the shadows of my past. After long days at work, I returned to my small apartment, affordable thanks to my first paycheck, and felt, for the first time, truly independent. Still, loneliness crept in from time to time. Seeking connection, I began participating in online forums where people shared their love for animals. That's where I met Carlos. He was from my city, shared my passion for zoology, and had a mischievous sense of humor that made me laugh even on my toughest days. We started talking more and more, sharing stories about our lives, discussing books, and chatting about the latest news in wildlife conservation. It felt like I had found a friend who understood me without the need for explanations. One day, Carlos suggested we exchange photos. I hesitated for a while but eventually sent him a picture of me at work, holding a rescued baby raccoon. He replied with a photo of himself smiling warmly at the camera. His kind eyes and genuine smile made my heart skip a beat. Despite our growing connection, the idea of meeting Carlos in real life terrified me. What if he saw the real me, learned about my weaknesses, my past, and decided to walk away? The fear of being abandoned again was paralyzing. Around the same time, I began connecting with Lily, a woman I met on a support forum for people with childhood trauma. She understood me in a way few others could because she had been through something similar. One day, Lily gave me advice that stayed with me. I write emails to people I can't talk to in real life. I pour out everything I feel, everything I want to say, but I never send them. It helps clear my soul. Inspired by her words, I started writing such emails. The first ones were addressed to my father. I told him everything, about overhearing Mom and Kiara's conversation, about how alienated I felt from my family, about my pain and disappointment. Then I started writing to Carlos. In those emails, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, open, something I couldn't manage in our online chats. In one email, I confessed, "Carlos, I think I'm falling for you, but I'm scared. I'm scared of letting someone in and being abandoned all over again." All these emails sat in my drafts folder. No one ever read them. Dad called me sometimes. His voice was a mix of concern and confusion. "Arabella, sweetheart," he'd say. "Why don't you come over for dinner this weekend? We miss you." Each time, I found an excuse not to go. "Sorry, Dad, I have a big project at work," or "I'm not feeling well this week. Maybe next time." Every such conversation broke my heart, but I couldn't go back to a house that no longer felt like home. It was just another ordinary Saturday evening. I went to the mall to pick up some essentials. A routine errand, nothing remarkable. But as I turned toward one of the displays, I heard a voice that immediately transported me back in time. "Arabella? Is that you?" I turned around and saw Leah. She stood just a few feet away, still the same as I remembered her, with that unwavering calm and kindness in her eyes, though her face now bore a few soft wrinkles that spoke of the passing years. Before I could fully process what was happening, we were hugging, as if no time had passed at all. It felt as though the years apart had vanished in an instant. "Arabella, this is my nephew, Paired," Leah said, gently brushing her hand over the hair of a boy who watched us with curious eyes. He couldn't have been older than 10, and his expression held a mix of caution and genuine interest. Over a cup of coffee, Leah told me about her life after she and Dad parted ways. It turned out she had lived alone until her sister passed away, leaving Paired in her care. Leah devoted herself to raising him, and it was clear the boy had become her entire world. After that meeting, we started seeing each other more often. Sometimes it was just the two of us, chatting and reminiscing about old times, and other times she would bring Paired along. I loved watching the boy come alive around her, how her gentle yet firm guidance helped him grow. One evening, Leah called me late at night, her voice tinged with panic. "Arabella, I need to leave town for an urgent matter. Can you watch Paired for me? I agreed, and within an hour, the boy was at my door with a backpack slung over his shoulder. His eyes glowed with gratitude, though it was clear he was a bit nervous. While I prepared dinner, he settled into the living room and started playing on my laptop. You can play after you finish your homework, I reminded him, bringing 2 plates of spaghetti from the kitchen. But when I entered the room, I saw his face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. Arabella, he began, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I did something bad. I saw your letters in the drafts folder, and I sent them. All of them. I froze. The world around me seemed to turn upside down. Those letters held my most private thoughts, the deepest things I had ever written. And now they had been sent. To Dad. To Carlos. That night, after Paired left, I lay in bed unable to sleep. My mind conjured every worst-case scenario. How would Dad react to my words? What would Carlos think? Would I ever be able to face either of them again? The next day, my phone rang. It was Dad. Arabella, he said, his tone serious. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the cafe near your old school? When I arrived, Dad was already waiting at a small table by the window. His face looked older than I remembered, lined with wrinkles, and his eyes were clouded with exhaustion. I got your letters, he began as soon as I sat down. Arabella, I had no idea you felt this way. I lowered my gaze, unable to meet his eyes. But he gently said, Look at me. When I did, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. I love you more than anything in the world. I'm so sorry I made you feel like you weren't important to me. That was never my intention. We talked for hours. I told him everything, how I felt abandoned when Mom came back with Kiara, how isolated I had been in the house, how my childhood fears had haunted me for years. Dad listened, truly listened. Sometimes he wiped away tears, other times, he simply sat in silence, absorbing my words. I need time to process all of this, he finally said. But, Arabella, I promise, we'll work through it. When he left, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had shown him the depths of my soul. But I knew this wouldn't be an easy path to navigate. My thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of my phone. It was Carlos. Arabella, he began, his voice warm yet slightly nervous, I got your letter. Anne. I feel the same way. I've been too scared to admit it, but I really like you. Maybe we could grab a coffee? I froze for a moment, surprised by my own boldness as I replied, yes. I'd love to. The next day, I met Carlos at a small coffee shop. In person, he was even more charming than I had imagined. His smile was warm and genuine, and it instantly calmed my anxious heart. We spent hours talking about our fears, dreams, and the past that had shaped us. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen and understood. There was so much kindness and sincerity in him that, being with him, I began to believe my past didn't have to define my future. Time flew by, the leaves began to fall, and autumn winds filled the streets with their rustling whispers. One morning, my phone rang. It was Dad. Arabella, he said, his voice warm but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I'd like you to come to Thanksgiving dinner. It's important to me that you're there. His tone left little room for refusal, so I agreed. On Thanksgiving Day, I stood at the doorstep of my childhood home, my heart racing. Carlos had offered to come with me for support, but I declined. This was my battle, and I needed to face it alone. The door opened, and there stood Mom. Her smile was forced, her eyes cold. Arabella, Mom said with false politeness, how nice of you to join us. I stepped into the house, where Kiara was sprawled on the couch, barely glancing up from her phone. Oh, you're here, she said indifferently. Dad emerged from the kitchen, his face lighting up with warmth. He hugged me as if trying to convey everything he hadn't been able to say before. I'm so glad you're here, sweetheart, he whispered. When we sat down for dinner, the tension in the room became almost palpable. Mom and Kiara exchanged glances, their smiles as artificial as masks. Dad, on the other hand, seemed surprisingly calm. As Mom began carving the turkey, Dad cleared his throat. "Before we start," he said, "there's something we need to discuss." He reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila folder. One by one, he began laying out documents. "I've known for a while that something wasn't right," he said, looking directly at Mom. "So I did a little investigating." The first document was a bank statement. "I found that large sums of money were being withdrawn from our accounts, transactions I never authorized," he said. Mom's face went pale, and Kiara suddenly found her plate extremely fascinating. Dad continued, pulling out the next document. "I hired a private investigator," he said. "I have photographic evidence of your meetings with a gentleman at the Rosewood Hotel." Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Michael, I can explain," she began. But Dad wasn't finished. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out the final document. "And lastly, I had a DNA test done," he said. "I found out that Kiara isn't my biological daughter." The room fell into a deathly silence. Kiara's phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. Mom looked as though she might faint. "I've already spoken with my lawyer," Dad continued, his voice steady but his eyes glistening with emotion. "I'm filing for divorce, and I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and Kiara to leave this house." Mom's face contorted with fury, replacing her shock. "You can't do this," she shouted. "I'll take everything you have." But Dad was resolute. "You won't. If you try to make any claims, I'll file a countersuit and demand reimbursement for everything you've taken, including the costs of raising Kiara. I have solid evidence." Tears streamed down Mom's face as she realized her game was over. Kiara sat in stunned silence, her world crumbling around her. In the days that followed, Mom and Kiara moved out. The house was filled with a new kind of silence, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was the kind of silence from which a fresh start could grow. Dad and I began rebuilding our relationship. We had weekly dinners, talking about things we hadn't addressed in years. We laughed, reminisced about the past, and even started planning a long overdue father-daughter trip. Over coffee one day, Dad mentioned Leah. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," he said, looking a little embarrassed. "About my mistakes. I reached out to Leah to apologize. We met and talked everything through." I smiled, genuinely happy to hear it. "Leah is an amazing woman," I said softly. Dad nodded, smiling back. Meanwhile, my life with Carlos only got better. His patience, kindness, and sincerity helped me confront my fears and insecurities. With his support, I started working on myself and even began therapy. For the first time in years, I felt like I could let go of my past and allow myself to be happy. What do you think about this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you soon.